The German Shepherd exploded into another violent burst of barking the moment a new handler stepped into the training yard. Chains rattled, dust flew across the concrete. Trainers immediately backed away as the massive military working dog lunged toward the fence with terrifying strength. For nearly 8 months, no one at the Army Military Working Dog Training Center in San Antonio, Texas, had been able to calm him. Every experienced handler had tried. Some used rewards, others tried stricter control. Nothing worked. The dog refused every command. He trusted no one. Then, just before the afternoon training session ended, a 79-year-old Army veteran quietly walked through the gate carrying nothing but a weathered walking cane and an old leather leash coiled around his wrist. One of the younger trainers frowned. "Sir, visitors aren't allowed inside the active kennel." Another quickly added, "Please stay back. That dog has already injured 2 handlers." The old man nodded politely and stopped several yards from the enclosure. He didn't move any closer. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the furious German Shepherd standing on the opposite side of the fence. The dog barked once more, then suddenly became still. The entire training yard fell silent. "That's impossible," one trainer whispered. The dog hadn't stopped barking for anyone in months. Colonel Rebecca Hayes, commander of the training center, stared at the elderly visitor in complete disbelief. Then recognition slowly spread across her face. Without hesitation, she walked toward him, came to attention, and rendered a perfect salute. "Command Sergeant Major William Bill Donovan," she said with unmistakable respect. "It's an honor to welcome you back." Every instructor nearby immediately followed her salute. The younger handlers looked at one another in confusion. None of them understood why the commander of one of the Army's premier military working dog centers had just saluted an elderly civilian carrying an old leather leash. Decades earlier, Command Sergeant Major Bill Donovan had been one of the Army's most respected military working dog handlers. Together with his legendary partner Rex, he had completed multiple combat deployments, located countless explosives, rescued trapped soldiers, and built training methods that were still quietly influencing military dog programs around the world. More importantly, the aggressive German Shepherd standing before him had once belonged to Bill's final student, a young handler who had never returned from his last mission. Within the next few minutes, everyone at the training center would discover why the dog had rejected every new handler for months, uncover the heartbreaking promise Bill had made years earlier, and witness a single spoken command accomplish what months of training never could. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, the military working dog kennels at the Army Military Working Dog Training Center in San Antonio, Texas, came alive with barking, commands, and the rhythmic footsteps of handlers preparing for another day of training. Most of the dogs eagerly waited beside their gates, tails wagging as their partners approached with leashes and training equipment. One kennel remained different, Kennel 14. The large German Shepherd inside never barked with excitement, he barked with anger. Every handler who approached the gate was met with the same fierce growl, the same tense posture, and the same refusal to obey even the simplest command. His name was Ranger. 8 months earlier, Ranger had returned from an overseas deployment after the death of his handler, Sergeant Ethan Cole. Since then, nothing had been the same. He refused food from strangers. He ignored verbal commands. He rejected every new handler assigned to him. 2 experienced trainers had already been bitten while attempting to regain his trust. "He's becoming impossible," one instructor muttered, while watching Ranger pace relentlessly inside the kennel. Another quietly shook his head. "No. What do you mean? He's not impossible." The instructor looked toward the restless dog. "He's grieving." Colonel Rebecca Hayes stood nearby, reviewing the latest behavioral reports. Every recommendation seemed the same. More conditioning, more controlled exposure, more obedience work. None of it had changed anything. Ranger still waited beside the kennel door every evening just before sunset, staring silently toward the main gate, where Ethan had always returned after training. He waited until darkness finally settled over the compound, then he quietly walked back inside alone. Every single day, Colonel Hayes folded the report and sighed. "Has anyone contacted Command Sergeant Major Donovan?" The room became quiet. One trainer answered carefully, "He hasn't visited the center in almost 10 years. Did anyone ask?" "Yes, ma'am." "And?" He politely declined. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. She understood why. Bill Donovan had retired shortly after losing both his longtime military working dog, Rex, and one of his most promising students, Ethan Cole. Since then, he had disappeared from public ceremonies, military reunions, and nearly every event connected with the working dog program he had helped build. Outside the kennel, Ranger suddenly stood perfectly still. Every muscle in his body tightened. His ears lifted. One young handler frowned. "What's wrong with him?" Another shrugged. "Probably heard another truck." Ranger wasn't listening to a truck. He was listening to footsteps. Slow, uneven, familiar. A few moments later, the front gate quietly opened. 79-year-old Bill Donovan entered the compound, wearing a faded army field jacket and carrying a weathered leather leash coiled neatly around one wrist. An old walnut walking cane rested in his other hand. He stopped several yards from the kennels without saying a word. Ranger exploded into furious barking. Handlers immediately backed away. "Sir," one trainer shouted, "please stay where you are. That dog isn't safe." Bill nodded politely. "I know." Colonel Hayes hurried toward him. "Comment, Sergeant Major?" Bill smiled warmly. "Morning, Colonel. I honestly didn't think you'd come." Bill glanced toward Kennel 14. "I almost didn't." Hayes looked at the old leather leash hanging from his wrist. "You brought Rex's leash." Bill gently ran his thumb across the cracked leather. Some promises deserved to be kept. The younger handlers looked at one another in confusion. They had never heard the name Rex before. Ranger continued barking so violently that foam appeared around his mouth. One trainer whispered, "He'll never calm down." Bill quietly looked through the chain-link fence at the German Shepherd. He didn't step closer. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there looking into the dog's eyes. Then, after nearly a minute of complete silence, Bill spoke 4 words in a calm, steady voice. "Ranger." "At ease, partner." The barking stopped instantly. Every person in the kennel yard froze. Ranger's ears stood forward. His breathing slowed. The furious military dog took one cautious step toward the fence, then another, before quietly sitting down without taking his eyes off the elderly veteran, standing only a few yards away. Not a single command given over the previous 8 months had ever produced that reaction. The entire training center fell into complete silence. No one in the kennel yard spoke for several long seconds. The only sound was Ranger's slow breathing as he remained seated, his eyes fixed on the elderly veteran. Every trainer present had spent months trying to earn the German Shepherd's trust. None of them had managed to make him sit on command. Bill Donovan had done it with 4 quiet words. Colonel Rebecca Hayes slowly lowered the behavioral report, still resting in her hands. "I don't believe this," she whispered. Bill smiled gently without taking his eyes off Ranger. "Neither does he." One young handler frowned. "Sir, what command was that?" Bill answered quietly. "One that isn't in any training manual." The handlers exchanged puzzled looks. Bill took one slow step toward the kennel. Ranger remained perfectly still. Another step. Still no growl. No barking. No lunging at the fence. Just quiet attention. "That's impossible," one trainer whispered. Colonel Hayes slowly shook her head. "No." She smiled faintly. "That's trust." Bill stopped just outside the gate. He still made no attempt to enter. Instead, he crouched carefully beside the chain-link fence, resting one hand on his walking cane. Ranger slowly walked closer, until only a few inches separated them. Bill gently reached through the fence, not to touch the dog's head, but to offer the back of his hand exactly the way experienced military handlers had done for generations. Ranger lowered his nose and inhaled slowly. Then, something remarkable happened. The big German Shepherd closed his eyes for just a moment. One of the instructors gasped softly, "He remembers him." Bill smiled sadly. "No." He looked at the dog with quiet affection. "He remembers where Ethan learned it." The younger handlers looked confused. Colonel Hayes answered for him. "Sergeant Ethan Cole trained under Command Sergeant Major Donovan." Bill nodded. 4 years. Every command Ethan ever gave Ranger, Hayes continued, began here. Bill gently scratched beneath Ranger's chin through the fence. "Good boy." Ranger leaned forward slightly but never took his eyes off Bill. Tears quietly formed in the eyes of one of the younger handlers. "He's been waiting," she whispered. Bill nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes?" He slowly stood and looked toward the kennel building. "May I come in?" Colonel Hayes answered immediately. "Of course." A young trainer hurried to unlock the gate before hesitating. "Sir?" He looked at Bill with concern. "If he changes." Bill smiled. "He won't?" The gate slowly swung open. Every instructor instinctively stepped backward, prepared to intervene if necessary. Bill entered the kennel one careful step at a time. Ranger never moved. He simply watched When Bill finally stood directly in front of him, neither man nor dog did anything for several long seconds. Then Bill quietly removed the old leather leash from around his wrist. Remember this? Ranger lowered his head toward the cracked leather. His nose trembled. He inhaled deeply once, twice, then gently pressed his forehead against the leash. The kennel yard fell silent again. Bill closed his eyes briefly. Rex carried this for 12 years. He smiled faintly. Ethan used to borrow it whenever he thought Ranger needed extra luck before certification tests. Colonel Hayes quietly wiped away a tear. One handler whispered, "Why didn't anyone know that?" Bill answered without looking away from Ranger. Because Ethan never wanted special treatment, Ranger slowly lifted his eyes toward Bill again. His tail gave the smallest movement anyone had seen in months. "That's the first time," one trainer whispered. "I've never seen him wag his tail." Bill smiled. "He's not happy." "Then what is he?" Bill gently rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder, hopeful. A heavy silence settled over the kennel yard. One young handler finally asked the question everyone had been carrying for months. "Sir." Bill looked up. "Yes? Why did Ranger reject every new handler?" Bill looked at the German Shepherd beside him before answering, because none of them ever understood what he was waiting for. What was he waiting for? Bill took a slow breath. "Permission." The handlers looked puzzled. Bill gently ran one hand across the old leather leash. Military working dogs are trained to trust one partner with their lives. He looked at Ranger. When that partner never comes home, his voice grew quieter. Some of them keep waiting because no one ever tells them the mission is over. Not a single person in the kennel yard spoke after that. For the first time, they realized Ranger had never been refusing to obey. He had simply been refusing to abandon the last promise he had made to the man he loved most. The kennel yard remained completely silent after Bill Donovan's words. No one had ever explained military working dogs that way before. The trainers had studied behavior, obedience, psychology, and conditioning. Yet none of those manuals had prepared them to understand grief. Bill slowly knelt beside Ranger until they were eye level. The old German Shepherd never looked away from him. "You've done your job," Bill whispered. Ranger's ears lifted slightly. "You've waited long enough." Colonel Rebecca Hayes quietly stepped closer, but stopped several feet away. She understood that this moment belonged only to the old handler and the dog. Bill reached into the inside pocket of his faded army jacket and carefully removed a small waterproof pouch. Time had faded the camouflage fabric, but the zipper was still intact. "I think this belongs to you," he said softly. Ranger immediately leaned forward, his nose trembling before the pouch had even been opened. Bill slowly unzipped it. Inside rested a worn military dog tag, a faded unit patch, and a bright blue rubber training ball covered with old bite marks. One of the younger handlers gasped. "That's Ethan's." Bill nodded quietly. "His family asked me to keep these." He gently rolled the blue ball across the concrete. It stopped only inches from Ranger's paws. The German Shepherd stared at it without moving. Then he slowly lowered his head, picked it up as gently as if it were made of glass, and carried it back to Bill. The elderly veteran smiled through moist eyes. "Good boy." He accepted the ball with both hands. Just like before, several trainers quietly wiped tears from their faces. Bill looked toward Colonel Hayes. "Did anyone ever bring his equipment back?" She slowly shook her head. "No?" Then Ranger never got to understand. One young handler frowned. "Understand what?" Bill rested one hand on the dog's neck. "In combat, dogs don't understand death the way we do." He looked around the kennel yard. "They understand routines." Everyone listened carefully. Every deployment ends the same way. He gently scratched behind Ranger's ears. The handler removes the leash, takes off the working harness, says a final command. He paused, and tells the dog the mission is complete. Silence settled across the yard. Ethan never came home to do that. No one breathed. Bill slowly picked up the old leather leash. So Ranger never stopped waiting for the next command. Colonel Hayes quietly covered her mouth. Suddenly, months of confusion made perfect sense. Every evening at sunset, Ranger had stood beside the gate because that was the hour Ethan normally returned from training. Every refusal to obey another handler had not been rebellion. It had been loyalty. Bill gently clipped the old leather leash onto Ranger's collar. The dog stood immediately, his posture straight and focused exactly as a military working dog should. Bill smiled sadly. Still perfect. He looked into Ranger's eyes and spoke in the same calm voice Ethan had once learned from him. "Ranger." The German Shepherd remained absolutely still. "Mission complete." The words echoed softly across the kennel yard. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the impossible unfolded. Ranger slowly lowered himself to the ground, rested his head against Bill's boot, and released a long, trembling breath. It was the first time anyone had seen the dog truly relax since Ethan's death 8 months earlier. Tears rolled freely down several faces. One young trainer whispered. He was waiting for those words. Bill nodded. Every day, he gently rested one hand on Ranger's head. Sometimes the hardest command a soldier ever receives, he looked around at the silent handlers, is the one that tells him it's finally okay to stop standing guard. No one in the kennel yard moved after Ranger rested his head against Bill Donovan's boot. The silence felt almost sacred. Even the other military working dogs had stopped barking, as though they somehow understood that something important had just happened. Bill quietly removed the old leather leash from Ranger's collar and gently rubbed behind the dog's ears. Ranger closed his eyes for a brief moment, completely at peace for the first time in many months. Colonel Rebecca Hayes finally stepped forward. "Bill," she said softly, "there's something I never told you." Bill looked up. "What is it?" She reached into a folder she had been carrying since morning and carefully removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. This was found among Ethan's personal belongings after the deployment. Bill frowned. "I don't remember seeing that." Hayes nodded. "His parents asked us to wait until we believed you were ready." Bill accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Across the front, in Ethan's familiar handwriting, were only a few words. "For Command Sergeant Major Donovan. If Ranger ever comes home without me." The kennel yard became completely silent. Bill carefully opened the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the page before he quietly began reading aloud. "Sir, if you're reading this, then things probably didn't happen the way either of us hoped." He paused for a moment, fighting emotion. "First, thank you. You taught me that a military working dog is never just a piece of equipment. He's a soldier, a partner, and a brother who trusts us with his life." Bill smiled sadly. "You were always a good student." He continued reading. "If Ranger survives and I don't, please don't let anyone think he failed me. He never will. If he refuses another handler, don't be angry with him. He'll simply be waiting for the only thing he has ever known, a command from someone he trusts." Several trainers quietly lowered their heads. Bill continued. "Sir, if anyone can help him understand that the mission is finally over, it'll be you." His voice nearly disappeared as he reached the final lines. "One last request. Please don't let Ranger spend the rest of his life wondering why I never came back." Bill lowered the letter. No one spoke. Colonel Hayes gently wiped away tears. "He knew," she whispered. Bill nodded slowly. He knew Ranger better than anyone. He looked down at the German shepherd still resting peacefully beside him. "Except maybe me," a young handler quietly asked. "Did Ethan always want to work with military dogs?" Bill smiled warmly. Since he was 16, the handlers looked surprised. Bill chuckled softly. "The first time we met, he wasn't old enough to join the army yet." "Really?" Bill nodded. He volunteered every weekend at the training center just to clean kennels. Several instructors smiled. He used to spend more time talking to the dogs than to people. Bill laughed. That's because the dogs interrupted him less. Gentle laughter filled the yard, easing the heaviness for a moment. Bill looked at Ranger again. When Ethan graduated from handler school, he smiled proudly. He could have requested any dog in the program. "Why did he choose Ranger?" one trainer asked. Bill looked toward the old German shepherd. "Because everyone else thought Ranger was too difficult." The trainers exchanged surprised glances. "He was aggressive?" Bill shook his head. "No." He gently scratched Ranger's neck. "He was misunderstood." Bill looked around at the young handlers standing before him. "Ethan once told me something I'll never forget." He smiled. He said the hardest dogs aren't looking for stronger handlers. His eyes rested on Ranger. They're looking for someone patient enough to earn their trust. Colonel Hayes quietly nodded. "Just like today." Bill smiled softly. "Exactly like today." Then he folded Ethan's letter, carefully placed it back inside the envelope, and slipped it into the same pocket where he had carried it close to his heart ever since opening it. "I made you a promise, son," he whispered almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. He looked down at Ranger. "Today, I finally kept it." News of what happened at the Army Military Working Dog Training Center spread quietly throughout the military working dog community. There were no reporters waiting outside the gates, and no dramatic headlines on television. The story traveled the way the most meaningful military stories always had, from one handler to another, from one kennel to the next, from veterans to young soldiers, preparing to earn the trust of partners who could never speak a single word. Before long, new handlers arriving at the training center were asking a different question. They no longer asked, "Where's the aggressive dog?" They asked, "Is Command Sergeant Major Donovan here today?" Bill usually was. Every Saturday morning, he quietly returned carrying the same weathered leather leash, the same walnut walking cane, and a pocket full of old training balls that he insisted every dog deserved to keep after graduation. No official schedule announced his classes, yet every seat around the training field filled before sunrise. The young handlers expected to hear stories about combat deployments, famous military dogs, and dangerous missions overseas. Instead, Bill walked to a small chalkboard near the obedience course and wrote 3 simple sentences. Trust is never demanded. It is earned. Every command carries responsibility. Your partner's life begins where your ego ends. Then he spent the next 2 hours talking almost entirely about relationships. A military working dog, he often said, doesn't follow your rank. He smiled at the young soldiers gathered around him. He follows your character. Those words slowly became part of the culture at the training center. Instructors repeated them during handler certification. Graduates wrote them inside notebooks. Some even tucked handwritten copies into the pockets of their working uniforms before every deployment. Ranger also began changing. Weeks after Bill's visit, he accepted a new handler for the first time since Ethan's death. The young soldier assigned to him was Specialist Noah Ramirez, one of the quietest graduates in the class. Before receiving Ranger's leash, Noah approached Bill with visible nervousness. "Sir." Bill smiled. "Yes? What if he never trusts me?" Bill looked toward Ranger, waiting patiently nearby. "Then don't ask him to." Noah looked confused. Bill gently placed the old leather leash into the young soldier's hands. "Give him reasons to." Noah nodded silently. Months later, Ranger and Noah graduated as one of the highest-rated handler teams in the program. Before their first deployment, Noah visited Bill one final time. "Sir," he said proudly, "I think he'd follow me anywhere now." Bill smiled warmly. "Good." He gently scratched Ranger beneath the chin. "Now make sure you always deserve it." Several years later, the Army officially renamed the Military Working Dog Leadership Seminar, held each spring. Bill protested immediately. "Don't put my name on it." Colonel Rebecca Hayes laughed. "We didn't." Bill looked puzzled. "You didn't?" She handed him the dedication plaque. Across the top were engraved the words, "The Ethan Cole and Ranger Partnership Seminar." Beneath them appeared a smaller inscription, dedicated to every military working dog team whose bond was built on loyalty, patience, and trust. Bill quietly smiled as he ran one hand across Ethan's name. He would have liked this better. Hayes nodded. "We thought so too." Years later, when Bill Donovan passed away peacefully at the age of 88, military working dog teams traveled from across the country to attend his memorial service. Veteran handlers stood shoulder to shoulder, with young soldiers just beginning their careers. Beside Bill's folded American flag rested the old leather leash that had once belonged to Rex, the blue rubber ball Ethan had carried for Ranger, and the weathered walking cane that had accompanied Bill on his final visit to the kennel. Ranger, now retired and gray around the muzzle himself, quietly lay beside the casket throughout the ceremony without moving once. Before leaving, Noah clipped the old leather leash beside a memorial display at the training center. Next to it hung one final bronze plaque. The greatest handler is remembered not by the commands he gave, but by the trust he earned and the lives he helped bring safely home. Every new military working dog team entering the center afterward stopped beside that display before beginning training. Most believed they were looking at an old leash. The instructors knew better. They were looking at a promise that had outlived war, grief, and time itself, a promise that one faithful soldier had kept, not only to his student, but to the loyal partner who had waited until someone finally whispered the words he had needed to hear all along. Some bonds are formed through words. Others are formed through years of quiet trust that never needs to be spoken aloud. The relationship between a military working dog and a handler belongs to that second kind. It is built one command at a time, one shared hardship after another, until two completely different lives begin moving with the same purpose. William Donovan understood that better than anyone. He knew that Ranger was never refusing to obey. He was simply keeping the last promise he had made to the person he loved most. Loyalty, when it is real, does not disappear simply because time has passed. Ethan Cole also left behind a lesson that reaches far beyond military service. He understood that leadership is not about controlling another living being. It is about becoming someone worthy of being trusted. Ranger followed Ethan into danger countless times because he believed his handler would never ask him to do anything without standing beside him. That kind of trust cannot be demanded. It can only be earned through patience, consistency, and love. The young trainers made the same mistake many of us make in everyday life. They tried to solve a broken heart as though it were a broken machine. They looked for better techniques, stricter discipline, and more effective training methods, never realizing that grief is not disobedience. Sometimes the strongest person or the strongest dog in the room is carrying a pain that cannot be seen from the outside. Understanding always reaches farther than force. Bill often reminded young handlers that trust is never demanded, it is earned. Those words apply just as powerfully to families, friendships, marriages, workplaces, classrooms, and every relationship we build throughout life. People rarely remember how loudly we spoke. They remember whether they felt safe beside us. They remember whether we kept our promises when keeping them became difficult. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when Ranger obeyed Bill's command. It was when one simple sentence, "Mission complete," finally gave a faithful partner permission to stop waiting at the gate for someone who would never come home. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness we can offer another soul is helping them find peace after carrying hope for far too long. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a veteran, military working dog team, first responder, mentor, teacher, or loyal companion whose devotion changed your life forever? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, military working dogs, sacrifice, family, faith, courage, honor, second chances, and the extraordinary people and animals whose loyalty continues changing lives long after their service ends. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every service member standing far from home. Protect every military working dog faithfully serving beside them. Comfort every family carrying the memory of someone they miss. Strengthen every handler entrusted with a loyal partner's life. And remind all of us that true leadership is never measured by authority. It is measured by the trust we inspire and the promises we keep. And may you never forget that sometimes the most powerful command ever spoken is not the one that sends someone into danger. It is the one that finally lets a faithful heart come home.